My name is Sarah Mavrinac. I am your moderator for the day, and I am also a Schwab social entrepreneur. If you are not familiar with this particular forum community, it's a very vibrant group of about 200 individuals and organizations, all of whom are committed to responding to some of the world's most pressing social, economic, health-related, and environmental problems. Yeah? So, of course, the world should be very concerned with our discussion here today. But for me personally, as a Schwab entrepreneur, and certainly for my Schwab peers, and I know for many of you who are concerned with sculpting a more effective social engagement program for your companies, this discussion today should have very pragmatic significance. And we hope very much that we can make it purposeful and pragmatic for you, and leave with a sense of specific takeaway, a specific to-do. Yeah? Indeed, I am standing here today really to symbolize connectivity rather than sitting here. We'd like this to be, again, an interactive debate, and so I want to move with you and connect you to our distinguished panel. And we do have a very distinguished and vital panel for you today. We have with us Dr. John McArthur, who is a senior fellow at the United Nations Foundation, Shinta Widjaja Kamdani, who is managing director of the Sintesa group in Indonesia, Dr. Dean Karlan, professor of economics at Yale University, and founder and director of Innovations for Poverty Action, a research group which is working to identify some of the most significant and effective means with which to tackle poverty. We have Brian Gallagher as well, the CEO and president of United Way Worldwide, and Nadya Saib, one of our global shapers, who is also co-founder and CEO of Wangsa Jelita in Indonesia. So we are attempting to understand a little better where we are today in this great struggle against poverty. We want to understand exactly where we are with respect to the Millennium Development Goals, particularly, which we are trying to realize by 2015. So we can start with that, and to the extent that we've realized any success, we want to understand exactly which programs and opportunities have been most successful and robust, so that we can then chart a path forward towards realizing the end of poverty in our time. So I think we should get started very quickly. John McArthur has really been involved with the MDG program since day one. So perhaps you can start us off with some insight into where we stand today.
Thank you. I think the first thing to say is that anyone from outside of Asia is coming to Asia, at least I certainly feel this way, to learn, because this is really the heart of the action. And there's so much happening, so much dynamism, so much momentum, so much progress, and obviously more than half the world's population in the region. And so this is really a profound story of, in my view, extraordinary success, even with a lot of bumps in the road, a lot of which are in the press on days like today. A lot of concerns about the markets, a lot of concerns about the fragility coming out of the advanced economies, very legitimate concerns, but the deep undercurrent is, I think, pretty extraordinary. We've seen on measures of extreme poverty, for example, people living under $1 or technically $1.25 a day. The World Bank's estimates recently announced are that the first Millennium Development Goal for that target has already been reached 5 years ahead of schedule. That means that people living under $1 a day was cut by half within less than a generation. This was for many people inconceivable barely a decade ago. The world has gone from roughly, there's a lot of debate on the specifics, but roughly 43% of the developing world under $1 a day to now roughly 21%. It's really Asia that's catapulted those numbers for the world. But also as Asia's gotten better, I would say it's played a huge role in helping other regions do better. And we're seeing that economic interconnectivity change. We've also seen that this region has helped to, I would say, catapult the world also on things like access to safe drinking water, access to sanitation, and where the goals have already been met in East Asia Pacific, for example, but also globally, we've seen how big a difference that's made. At the same time, we've seen, I would say, some pretty persistent challenges on things like food and nutrition. We've seen food price spikes adding a lot of volatility around the world. We've seen, I would say, far too much stagnation on measures of stunting, measures of undernutrition. We don't really have a global system to solve that problem. We're usually treating the symptom rather than solving the problem. We have a lot of environmental strains that are not yet being dealt with very successfully. And certainly we have a lot of complexity around fast-growing economies, trying to go low carbon, clean energy, and I don't think we have a global policy framework for that in any way. And again, nowhere is that more fundamental than Asia. So those are the kind of the pluses and minuses. At the same time, on the opportunities, I think one of the most profound changes is the, of course, information connectivity of the world. We are talking about the BRICS. I was reading Kleiner Perkins just put out a report on internet usage around the world, and I realized there's 4 countries which we could call the CHIPS, China, India, Indonesia, and Philippines. Those 4 countries are the fastest growing internet users in the world. They account, just the 4 of them, for more than half of the increase in internet usage last year. Number 5 is Nigeria, by the way. So it's an extraordinary growth, hundreds of millions of people coming online, and it's changing the way we think about things. And in India, just last month, according to the data, more than half of the internet usage is now on mobile phones rather than desktops. So the internet isn't just in the rooms, it's wherever people are. And we're seeing that those forces, I think, are going to change a lot about how we even think about what it means to be interconnected and how we think about tackling poverty around the world.
Indeed. So there is great reason for celebration and for success.
我们现在要很高对我们这个成果很开心，但是我们也不可以怠惰下来，我们要不可以忽视里面的复杂性，尤其是要帮助让大家去了解说什么办法可行，什么办法不可行。接下来我要很快的来请 Nadya 来自印度尼西亚。这个千禧年的这个发展计划是一个非常高的目标，非常一个大家的渴望。他们也有很仔细的一些衡量的方式，但是这些衡量的方式常常会失去了这些人民的声音。在你的了解里面，如果说这个世界是否已经有所改善了呢？在印度尼西亚的状况是怎么样？这是我自己个人的经验。我想要说的是，我第一次接触到这个贫穷的问题的时候，是一个意外。我完全没有料想到，我是一个药师，我2008年毕业，拿到了我的药师执照，开始进入职场，我做香皂，我们做一个自然天然的香皂，只是一个完全的是一个商业的一个想法。后来呢，我们发现有一些这个香皂的一些做法，我们想要去我们的事业要进入到下一个阶段，那我们跟我们农民呢有接触。他们提供我们原料，所以很意外的，我发现了这个在印度尼西亚里面的这些玫瑰花农，在我住的这个附近，他们的一些生活里面的一个循环，他们在很早就，他们的学业都不高，他们大概都没有办法进入到高中，他们很早就结婚。他们这个生活的循环呢是这样子一直的持续下去的。那我发现说，我也很幸运的，发现我自己有很多的选择权，我可以去大学，我可以成立我自己的事业。但是这个对他们来说，并不会发生在这些农村的农民身上，他们没有这样的机会。
3 groups, and then they are very in charge. the farmers can do nothing about that. So what I did, I created a free trade system, and I also invested in their children's education. I might not be able to help their parents. I might not be able to help the farmers there. It might be too late, but at least I can help their next generation. So it's a long-term process. I cannot see the result like nowadays, but I think it's moving there. Now they have changed their way of thinking. They realize that education is important to change the life cycle, to get out of this, persistence of poverty. And I believe there's hope. So.
I really do think that we can think of poverty really as often being lack of choice. There are so little opportunities available for people, and what you are doing with your organization is in fact creating some element of choice. Indeed. Brian, so you and United Way operate at a global level, and you have a visibility of the world in many different parts of the world. And is what you see similar to Nadya? Are you seeing increased choice, increased opportunity?
We are. I would first make the point that, we have seen this, these great strides in poverty alleviation, and I think the argument can be made because we took a more market-oriented approach that integrated global markets that created job creation and opportunities for countries and for people that didn't really get it in the old model, this international relief of debt, then onerous austerity mandated requirements. And so I think that's where I would start. What I would also say then is the key now is how do you put economic development together with social development, and I think that's what we're hearing here. That we'll get into inclusive growth later, I know, but if we're going to sustain the opportunity, we're going to have to make sure that social services, social supports, education support actually go hand in hand with macroeconomic strategy and policy. And I'd use an example that for us in Indonesia, again, our affiliate in Indonesia, Yayasan Mitra Mandiri, is working with companies, local government, and schools to make sure that young people in both Jakarta but also in rural schools, poor children, have access to supplemental education and social services. And specifically, Citibank and others working with the local government are providing savings strategies and education programming for thousands of kids in 300 schools, in both, again, in Jakarta and in rural Indonesia. Because, as she said, so many of those children don't have the opportunity and the access, but the most enlightened government and the most enlightened business leaders now are understanding the need to put their two different policies and practices together, and increasingly we're seeing that across the world.
So you are fundamentally seeing improvements in savings rates, for example, which also increase opportunity choice?
Yes, and it does affect the parents, because the strategy is make sure that the parents are involved in, that these are actually plays that are put on in schools. And volunteers coming from corporations and other places to put on plays to teach kids about how to save and how it ties to education, importantly how it ties to opportunity going forward, and the parents are involved in the plays and in the audience. So it actually does have an effect on parents as well.
So that's not just about increasing choice, that's about increasing confidence levels, I presume, when you're involved in some kind of a creative endeavor, a play.
We just heard it next door, that the best way to empower folks is to actually give them the choice, is inclusion and engagement. So if we come in as a government, as an NGO, as a corporation and say, we've got a strategy that we think will work for you, versus coming in and saying, we think we have an opportunity, but we want you to help shape it, whether you're a young person, a parent, a village leader, that's where we see progress. And we see it in our developed countries where we do business, and we see it in developing countries as well.
So it's not just about giving choice, it's about empowering people to use the choice effectively.
We should think of ourselves, I think all of us should think of ourselves as a platform of resources. And our job is to give access to as many people as possible to take advantage of the resources we enjoy.
So already, we are not just celebrating the success, but actually describing why that success has been realized. And I wanted to drill down into that, certainly, much more specifically. Shinta, you are very involved with, I know, GEPI, with the Global Entrepreneurship Program in Indonesia. And I understand that you have very strong ideas about the role of entrepreneurship in poverty alleviation. Could you tell us about why you think that is such a significant force?
Yes, thank you, Sarah. I think, first of all, of course, there is definitely a big improvement in terms of number. If you look at in Indonesia, the data says that in our own Indonesian data, there's 31 million people in the poverty at the moment. However, the ADB number looks larger, which is about 43 million. So there's quite a gap because obviously there's a difference in terms of what's the minimum daily income. But I have to say that when I travel around in the rural area of Indonesia, for my work, I can see that poverty are still very much seen, and there have been a lot of initiative from different kind of organization, whether that's international, as well as the local, as well as the government, obviously, to combat poverty. What is really the role of private sector? When we look at ourselves, running big businesses, we have CSR program and so forth. I realized one thing that, we are lacking that connectivity. We're lacking to have one catalyst organization in which putting together all our effort. Each of us are doing so many good things, but independently. So that's how, I started actually working with entrepreneurship very early days in '98 when there was a May riot in Indonesia, and at that time, Jakarta, a lot of businesses in specific areas in Jakarta was really destroyed. And at that time, we, the business people, realized that we have to do something, in order to help these people get up again and start up this business. So that's how I actually started working with a lot of these small businesses to re-up their business and start their business again. But over the years, I find that, it's the strength of this connectivity of bringing all the private sector together give us a whole new level of maximizing our effort. So that's how we started GEPI, the Global Entrepreneurship Program Indonesia. We brought 13 successful entrepreneurs in Indonesia, big businesses, and we say, what can we do to promote entrepreneurship? We all believe that entrepreneurship is the key factor of developing the economic growth. But and there's many things many initiatives that have been done. It's clearly seen that working with the government is one aspect as well. Government comes with many regulatory that are, whether they say there is support, in actuality, in the implementation, obviously it's not really supporting on how promotion of entrepreneurship. So we then believe that GEPI become the catalyst organization, and we provide the ecosystem. So there are 6 areas that we believe is important. One, obviously, is identifying the entrepreneurs. And when we said identifying, we go to all area around Indonesia. At the moment, there's only 0.18% entrepreneurs. And the target, obviously, like China is 2%. I mean, 0.18 is far below on where we have to stand. So we first have to identify these people. And where are they? They're all over rural Indonesia as well as the urban. And then the second thing, obviously, is education, the training. At the moment, we are still pushing for the government to not only provide entrepreneurship program, but also put the entrepreneurship as the curriculum in our basic education system. We believe when we start giving entrepreneurship early days, then it really makes a whole new ballgame for the children when they are being taught. So this is something that we are fighting. We want to put entrepreneurship in the primary education starting early days. The third, obviously, is connecting. A lot of these entrepreneurs have many great ideas, but they don't have the resources. So we have to connect them. You know, obviously, geographically being Indonesia with 17,000 islands, you know, it's not as simple as that in connecting people. But obviously now with the social media and everything, obviously it's much easier. And we believe in connectivity. The fourth aspect is access to financing. And this is a clearly big issue. You know, a lot of the entrepreneurs don't have this access. The financial institution give funding only with specific collateral, and that's not possible for a lot of the startups. So definitely funding is a big issue. The fifth thing is the government aspect, the regulatory aspect. I think that is also very important because we want the government to come up with regulation that can really support promoting entrepreneurs. And the last thing, I think, is celebrating. We want entrepreneurs to share best practices, to really celebrate those that has been successful. So I think those are the 6 key areas that we are trying to do.
It is such a brilliant vision that you are putting forward, Shinta, I think, of creating this collaborative effort in which the private sector and the government are creating the ecosystem within which the poor can thrive, and within which the poor can educate themselves and begin to more effectively utilize the choice which is being given to them. It's a lovely vision that you're creating, for me at least. And I have to say, I think especially at World Economic Forum, the notion of entrepreneurship as a key factor in alleviating poverty is obvious. How many of you would think that we need to be promoting entrepreneurship to end poverty? We see a lot of hands go up, right? Everybody knows that small business really is the foundation of almost all economic development. But I don't think it's as simple as just declaring that we should have more entrepreneurs and more entrepreneurial effort. There are good programs and not so good programs. And Dean, this is an area of your expertise. Perhaps you could shed some light on how we effectively promote entrepreneurship?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So I have no idea. In a general way, and I don't. So the downside of going last, I'm going to deviate from your specific question, although I'm going to come back to that at the end. The downside of going last is I had kind of a prepared set of ideas that I want to put forward, but after hearing the comments from everybody, which were fascinating, I learned a lot. I now have a totally different thing I wanted to say. And I think this incorporates a lot of what everyone's putting, the things I was hearing different people say, but in a different, very different way. I think there's 3 questions that are underlying what everybody's saying that we're not asking in quite the right way, though. And these are, for what it's worth, these are 3 questions that I use when I teach economics, and when I teach undergraduate or PhDs at all levels. So it's 3 kind of guiding principles to thinking about the world. The first is, what's the market failure? Why aren't we just letting businesses do their thing and free markets work? Because there are a lot of situations where that's actually the right answer, right? That's actually the straw man we often put up as economists, at least. And that's not to say that's always right. The key is figuring out, when is that wrong? When is there a market failure? When is there a problem that requires someone intervening and doing something else other than hands off, let the market work? But a lot of the change that we've seen, this goes back to what John opened up with the statistics about China and India and dollar a day. A lot of that probably, we think, comes just from markets opening up and growth happening. That's not coming from donor money. That's coming from lack of action. It's a good thing, right? You know. So, but the first is, you got to understand what's the problem in the first place, and why are we trying to tackle it in any way other than hands off? Okay, and that means, are we tackling it through government regulation? Are we tackling it through donor money? So a lot of the underlying things that we've now been talking about here have to do with interventions. Okay, there's a problem, it's poverty. In this particular context, it's manifesting itself with low education, bad health, and so now we're going to go in through government money or an NGO, and we're going to go deliver some service. And now we have to make kind of these tough choices. Right? And here, this is where I hear lots of platitudes in these conversations about, oh, I think it's about entrepreneurship, I think it's about this, I think it's about that. I have no idea which it is. Right? These are all good ideas, and we can list them all out, and they all can be somewhat sensible. The question is, which approach is actually going to solve the market failure, right? And which one is going to do it in a cost-effective way? So those are the 3 questions. Is there a market failure? Does the intervention actually address the market failure and solve the problem that we were addressing? And third is, what's it cost? And is it worth it? Right? Because at the end of the day, we all have fixed resources. Even the wealthiest nation and country and person, foundation, company, has to make choices. And so which is it? Which way are we going to have the most impact on increasing education if we think there's a problem with undereducation, for instance, which we do? So, and that last part is the hardest one to tackle, because attribution is really hard. You cannot just follow people over time and argue that, okay, we caused this, right? So take a look at the $1 a day number. I have a lot of admiration for what I think MDGs have done and the effort behind it, and I in terms of rallying attention, rallying resources, it's really transformed the conversation in many ways. What I do not think it has done is reduced the number of people on $1 a day in that type of way, right? And I see you nodding, so I think you agree. And I say this with true admiration.
I'll come back to that, but yeah.
Maybe not. Maybe I'll hear it later.
Mostly. Yeah.
So I say this with genuine admiration for what I think you personally and everybody that you work with has done in terms of rallying that attention. But we should not be attributing the reduction and the achievement of the MDGs to aid money, for instance, right? Unless we have and so this is where the key is having some actual measures of what's working and what's not. And this is where I'll leave you with a final thought, which is one of my biggest hopes in conversations like this, is to inspire people to be less ambitious. We can make huge impacts. But the minute we start getting way too ambitious and way too excited is the moment we just set ourselves up for disappointment. When the minute we get kind of clear data. So and this is now the answer to your question that you opened up with. When we look at micro-entrepreneurship and we look at microcredit, it had huge enthusiasm. The impacts, once the careful studies were done, that were set up with randomized trials, that we saw as some villages got services, some did not, some people got loans, other people did not. We do not see it lifting everybody out of poverty. Right? Some important changes were made. I'm still a supporter of these programs, and I think they should flourish. But it was not lifting people out of poverty. So anytime we get too much exuberance behind any one tool in our arsenal, we're going to set ourselves up for disappointment.
Okay,
so we need to be less ambitious.
Thoughtful analysis is essential. And I'm also an academic, and I have enormous faith in the scientific method and in evaluating. But sooner or later, we just have to, go with our gut. What do we imagine really is going to work? And it seems as though entrepreneurship would be the thing. Is there truth out there? I think we make a truth to a certain extent. Think about microenterprise from a gender perspective as well. Aren't we seeing enormous benefit there?
No, actually, that was actually the biggest failure of the studies, was it did not find an improvement in power for the women. Micro savings did actually lead in the one study that has looked at that in savings space, yes, but microcredit did not do that. At least in the studies that have been done. That's all I can say.
Okay.
I'm limiting into there's 3 studies that looked at that outcome measure and did not find a single impact on it. Did find other positive impacts.
And yet you say that you would still encourage these initiatives to be run and to be nurtured?
Yes. But it should come from, look, they're sustainable from a business perspective. Let investors come in and do that. I would not put donor money into supporting a perfectly sustainable business. There's no need for it. It just crowds out the investor money. There are roles that microcredit can play for bringing in other services, and that could use donor money for providing health services, educational services. There's a group of people that are frankly too poor to receive microcredit loans. That's the type of thing that might require aid money. But in terms of what we should do, we should just let them flourish and let them do their thing, and not provide donor money, but not get in their way either.
Okay, you're kind of bursting my bubble a bit here. But okay, John, we clearly are not entirely sure of why we have realized the success. Although we have some insights and we have the foundations upon which we can learn more, certainly, especially with Dean's studies. Where do we go from here? Do you see given sort of the ambiguity about the process and the mechanisms through which we make the change, still a clear-cut path for us moving forward? Are there low-hanging fruit that we can pluck in this effort to alleviate poverty?
Well, just to use technocratic language, I would say I agree with most of the Dean's data points, but I would add other ones and maybe draw a slightly different line. Because I think if you look at poverty, for example, it's absolutely true. We need to be cautious on attribution. I couldn't agree more. I think anything around market mechanisms, which are pretty tough to predict and understand how it's going to go in the most sophisticated economies in the world and the least sophisticated economies, that's very true. And some modesty is really required. And unfortunately, we've seen that a lot of the microfinance results aren't what many would have expected. At the same time, I think we need to distinguish between types of poverty problems. So if you look at the health and disease issues, which we were talking earlier today, I think the Millennium Development Goals have unquestionably played a profound role in changing global efforts and many national efforts around health. Part of that is around aid. Part of that is around a basic issue of public and private finance. And so I would agree that China, for example, has been very much in charge of its own development. I don't think that's an argument against public finance. I think public finance and public policy in China has been absolutely fundamental to the region's growth. That, to me, isn't necessarily an argument against aid. That's an argument for saying don't try and pretend that aid was what caused that success. And at the same time, one of the things we've seen, and where I would draw a different line, is around the words of ambition. I think that we have to be very careful and very, again, modest in assessing what has worked and what we think works, especially on the economic sides, because even the best business plan in the world, look at Facebook. Facebook did not follow its original business plan in many ways. One of the world's great economic successes, and most entrepreneurs will tell you that their strategy evolves over time, and the original business plan is a best guess, and everyone in the room knows this much better than me. At the same time, if you look at many of the great successes, whether it's eradication of smallpox, very famously, if it's advent of a global effort around HIV/AIDS treatment, if it's global effort around malaria control, things that are true life and death issues for extremely poor people, all of those started with a big fight around ambition. It started with everyone saying it's too hard to do, don't even try it. It started with a lot of technical debates on you're never going to get the money to pay for it, so don't bother. It started with a plan to say, this is a public health emergency, it is a market failure, how do we solve these problems? And then a lot of learning by doing en route. And so I think we have to avoid, with the caution on the private sector side, we have to avoid, I think, false dichotomies too, because a lot of these are blended strategies of public and private sector and increasingly non-governmental organizations. We have a lot of new and creative ways where even a lot of non-governmental organizations are adding private sector dimensions to their work to add commercialization where they think that will work well. And then we also have a lot of private sector agencies going into more philanthropic work to make their things available. Say you have drug companies making drugs available at cost, freeing up their patent regimes, lots of new and sophisticated methods underway there. So I think we have to I would agree with the three questions very much. Think of what are the problems, like backward induction, what's the problem, what's not getting solved, what's the blend of approaches that might solve it. I think we can't shy away from the role of government. We can't shy away from the role of the public sector, even while we ask others and expect others to do more. And if we're thinking about the second half of extreme poverty, after the Millennium Goals, again, we were talking about this earlier, I think we shouldn't just be thinking about what's the role of government goals. I think we should be thinking about, my own view, what's the role of corporate and industry goals? What's the role of nonprofit and civil society goals? What is a really 21st century approach to ending poverty? And that will probably look quite different in many ways to build on the successes of the past decade.
But, okay, John, I want to push you a little bit further, though. Sure. Clearly, there is need for collaborative effort. We cannot forget government in this, although we can also harness the energy of the private sector and all the creativity and social enterprise, for example. But what 3 things should we prioritize moving forward? We've come a long way. We have to finish this work.
For
Health,
which problem? I think...
for the extreme poverty. Do we focus on health? Do we focus on gender equality? Should we start building in the social software systems to facilitate confidence building and new leadership at the base of the pyramid?
This is the basic tension. How do you have a simplified enough agenda that people can understand it?
Yeah.
But an open enough agenda that it leaves room for the realities of a very complex and interconnected world. So do you want to pick school or health or business, bank accounts for your children?
And let me throw environment in here too.
Yeah,
we have that complicating
I don't think those
factor.
are the only 3 things that matter for children, but I think that at least those 3 things matter for all children. But I think many other things matter too. And the world is big and complicated.
Yeah.
And I think we can agree on basic agenda for health. We can agree on basic agenda for food and agriculture. We can agree on a basic agenda for education. I think we can agree on basic agenda. Dean's done the world's leading work on this. How do you build the savings accounts? How do you get those economic toeholds in place? I think we can do all of those, and let's pick our priorities, but let's realize in a big world, there's a lot of people working on the health problems. There's a lot of people working on the connectivity problems. There's a lot of people working on the savings problems. Each of them merits their own ambition, I think, to be creative and innovative in their own way.
Okay, I really need some more priorities, though. So, Brian,
So
then I want to hear Dean.
I would choose education,
Okay.
empowerment of women, and a rural poverty strategy. And when you see success in HIV or malaria, or you see failure in, so we've made great progress on lifting people out of poverty, but we still have huge income disparities across the world, in both the developed world and the developing world. Where you see success or failure is because we haven't created these ecosystems. It's not just identifying the different roles for government and the market, business, and NGOs. It's creating an ecosystem where you get agreement on the outcome. What is it that we're trying to achieve? What are the common metrics? So common metrics create common language. What's the role delineation? So what will government do? So I'm not saying international aid isn't something that we need, but it's not gonna cure poverty. It has a role. And then what's the marketplace's role? What's the NGO role? You then have to have a communication strategy that is both, I think, external and across stakeholders. And importantly, and I think what's almost always the missing piece that breaks down these efforts is you have to have an organization or a group of organizations who create the infrastructure. Because, we come to these meetings and we talk about, this coordinated effort, and then we all go back and run our institutions. And what's the glue that holds it together? My observation in Asia specifically would be that the government is going to play a much bigger role than that than, say, in the West, where you're going to have a different set of infrastructure organizations. But you have to you got to put the economic and human development agenda together, and you have to agree on goals and metrics starting there, because if not, you're going to have this independent effort and claim success by stakeholder group.
So what you have just said is so consistent with what Shinta has been trying to do with the GEPI program, creating that ecosystem, that infrastructure, which would be supportive of the individual effort of the micro-entrepreneur, for example. Now, I want to come back to you, Shinta, in a minute to talk about how we can promote more such ecosystem construction around the world, and particularly how we can involve the corporate sector. I mean, what are the commercial interests in doing so? But I want to go back to Dean, too. Do you agree with Brian, given the research that's been done, that these are the areas we should focus attention on? Where would you were discussing micro savings earlier. Is that not a silver bullet, but a significant factor?
So I think I'm more aligned with what John said. I think it's the wrong question, to be honest. I don't mean this as a criticism personally. I'm just saying, I think the question is more how we do what we do.
We just got to do something.
Yeah, is how we do what we choose to do, rather than choosing across sectors. And I have one two simple explanations for why. One is, if some groups decided to go all in on health, some other people would fill in the gaps and do more on education. And so I don't think, we're not going to come up with this forum and everyone's going to agree on health and all of a sudden, great, we're going to see. The gaps will get filled in by others, not to say completely, it's not to say there wouldn't be some resources, but what really matters is that we do health right, that we do education right, that we do entrepreneurship right.
But waiting for everybody to do what they kind of feel like doing is perhaps part of the reason why we have poverty in the first place. Because there aren't enough people who dedicate action towards a solution. And so we just need the insights.
No, I think the problem is that we don't always know. I mean, look, yes, we need more resources at the table too, but we need to know how to fight the fight better. And it's not to say that on the margin, when we had better evidence, we wouldn't say, yes, let's go put some more money into these things in health because there's really strong evidence that this is a very effective tool, and that might start shifting our allocations around. But I'm not going to get up here and sit there and say, I think health is all about health, not education. I will tell you that I think it's heavily about risk. I'm much happier talking about outcome measures, but now I'm putting on my personal hat and saying, as a philosophical perspective, what are the things that I think are really important to one's status and self-esteem and feeling and comfort in life and happiness? This is not about sectors and saying, oh, I think it's education or health. This is just saying, I think risk is a systemic issue across all facets of life that we need to deal with. One thing that Shuchi mentioned in her panel that I thought struck me a lot was about jobs. And when you're talking about, going back to your questions about jobs versus entrepreneurship, there's a huge improvement for having a job in terms of lowering risk versus being a micro-entrepreneur. So if I had to choose between those two, I'd much prefer to get someone a job than make them a micro-entrepreneur.
Jobs, development. Okay, yeah, indeed. Okay, so Shinta, talk to us. How can we create more jobs? How can we encourage the corporate to become more involved in the construction of the ecosystems?
I think why we talk about entrepreneurs is of course talking about job creation.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, how many jobs are available if you don't create more entrepreneurs? So when we talk about the microcredit, yes, microcredit is important. Perhaps the success story is a big question mark, but it is really a start, because when we talk about microcredit, we usually start with community development, is volume, right? The question is sustainability. Are those microcredit providing jobs? The answer is no, because a lot of them stay where they are, they don't grow. So we find that there is a big gap from the because there's a huge attention on this microcredit. But where is the attention to the growth companies?
Absolutely. Nurturing small business, not micro enterprise, but small business which employs 4, 5, 6 people, at least. If we can move to that stage, wouldn't that be tremendous?
Yes, so we need to look at companies that have the opportunity to also grow and actually employ people, right? And I think this is where the attention has been so much lacking in that area. So we at GAPI has very much focused on that as well, supporting startups in which we provide the environment necessary. When we talk about funding, for example, the government has pushed all these big banks to provide, of course, microcredit as well, funding. But we're talking about more a year of financing. Is it sufficient for the business to just get a year of financing to get it up and running? The data shows that, yes, we have helped a lot of new businesses, but it's not sustainable. So what we are now looking into is the opportunity for the big businesses, the entrepreneurs, big successful entrepreneurs, to also invest in the business. So this is why we are creating like an angel investment fund, for example, for startup, because we believe what they need is not just funding, but also mentoring. To develop their business, they don't just need the money, they need the know-how. So I think this is where we are creating that ecosystem in terms of development of this entrepreneur from this microfinancing or SMP level going into the next level. Now, I also want to touch that. I think it is, when we work together with the government and so forth, we realize that there is a beautiful strategy in place, but what is always missing is the action, right? I mean, when we convert from the strategy to action, that's where we find a lot of the loopholes. And so we went to the government and say, where is our roadmap, where we can map and say, where's our role? So, private sector role is here. This is the NGO roles. This is where the government. So we need to each know where we stand.
Exactly. where we stand
God
and
you
where we
did
should
affirm.
go.
We can break.
And where we should go. And we're looking for some advice. I think. I think from all of the experts, where exactly should we be devoting our energies and our talents? Nadya, talking about why we should, as corporate individuals, as corporate leaders, become more involved in constructing this ecosystem. I mean, why have you gotten into this space? Why have you brought such, it seems you have such heart in your organization. Why? And what do you get out of it? And are there some lessons that you might share with the rest of the corporate community that would motivate them to become equally involved?
Well, before I answer the question, I would like to say that I agree with Brian that he said that, you know, you have to know your role. If you ask the question, what should you prioritize in escaping from poverty, you should know where you stand for. I mean, maybe government has their own way to end poverty. I am, as a social entrepreneur, have my own way, and everyone can play a key role to be involved in this mission. So, and also like Ibu Shinta said, everyone, I mean, for example, in Indonesia, there are lots of new entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs is like a big hit in our country. But the question is, and how about to make it sustainable? And we really need support. So everyone in every background can help in ending this poverty, either to help the entrepreneur movement, or like becomes an entrepreneur as well. And answering the question, how I finally working with community, it was like, when you realize how lucky you are, you educated, you are well educated, you have this network, you can work in a multinational company perhaps, and then you see these people who had not so much options like you do now, it touches your heart. I mean, especially when you see what I experienced. I saw this girl, younger than me. She ended her education at elementary school, and she had 2 children, and also she had nothing to do. I mean, she helped her husband as a farmer, and she had no options. It's like, I don't want to say it's her fate or her destiny, but I really want to, giving an opportunity. I might not be able to help her, but I think I will be able to help her children. And that's the reason why I want to invest in the children's education. I want to stop this life cycle to happen in the next generation. So maybe you can do that too.
And
I believe so.
Sarah, can I make 2 quick points to this? Is that I actually took a stand on your question about what 3 things.
Absolutely.
But I agree
Thank
with
you.
Dean. It doesn't matter what my opinion is. What matters is that I have a place to debate it, and that you get the right people in the debate that are going to stay together, and that's where you get role definition. That's when you get, okay, government's going to do this. They're going to create an incentive scheme that actually creates jobs. And the second point is that I think it is best played out locally. That the role of the UN, the role of national government, the role of funders should be to create incentive for, at neighborhood level, at village level, at city level, to create this framework that allow the debate to happen, plans to get created, because that's most often where it happens. I think John would agree. If you look at least as I look at, AIDS and malaria in Africa, it was because the Gates Foundation and others said, oh my God, we're putting in all this money, and we realize there's no infrastructure down there. And they had to go back and rethink it and make sure that infrastructure was being created, and there was those NGOs on the ground and government and village leaders that created that ecosystem.
So, if I might summarize what you've just said, you suggest that we really need the local knowledge, and that all of us who want to become engaged must begin to just look more carefully, more critically, as you're suggesting, Dean, at what exists in, what key problems exist in our communities. And then there are some suggestions that micro-savings could have a big impact, that certainly entrepreneurship could have a big impact, that certainly enabling women to work more effectively, to educate women, and providing healthcare. All of this could potentially work, but we must begin to simply experiment, I guess, and then critically analyze the consequences. You would agree with that, Dean?
Yep.
Indeed. Indeed. Okay, so there's already
fully.
so many hands up. Yes, I think it's time to turn the mic over to the audience.
Thank you. My name is Amina Rasul, and I'm from Mindanao in the Philippines. A couple of points that I'd like to raise. First, conditional cash transfers. Poverty, the critical issues there, apart of course from absolute poverty, nutrition, as you said, health issues, poor education. In the Philippines, we've been experimenting with conditional cash transfers patterned after Latin America. So this is a direct subsidy for families, but it is not a dole-out because it's linked to improvement in the education of children. So they have to show their report cards. Improvement in health. Every month, the parents must bring the children to the health center to be measured. And if they fail in any of these indicators, the subsidy is cut. So this is meant to be very short term. And the improvement in poverty levels is significant. But if you're looking at what the private sector can do, the other day, one of the young leaders we brought for the ASEAN Emerging Leaders Forum spoke about technology for the bottom of the pyramid. In the Philippines, everybody's got a cell phone, including the poorest of the poor. And they're now looking at creating apps that would allow the small retail stores, we call them sari-sari stores, so that they can learn from their cell phone things like accounting or literacy, things like that. So they're developing this for Philippine sari-sari stores. And I think the application of this for Asia is remarkable. It's unfortunate that this young man cannot join because he's not part of the forum. He's just part of the emerging leaders thing. And the third is literacy, adult literacy. The international community focuses so much attention on basic education, but there has not been all that much attention on literacy for the adults. And I ask you, how can an adult mother or father ever really help a child to do well in school? Oh, and one thing, entrepreneurship. I used to be Minister of Youth of my country. We did a survey of young people asking them their aspirations and competing, 1 and 2, finding a job or being an entrepreneur. So why don't you, private sector, provide entrepreneurship support and start them early? Can't you do a little contest, a little project for high school students so that they learn the basics of entrepreneurship?
Did you have a specific question that you wanted the panelists to address, or? Oh, the transfers. Have you studied that, Dean?
Yeah, not me personally, but people in my that work with Innovations for Poverty Action, the nonprofit that I started. And the short of it is that it matters a lot how you do it. So I would be very concerned about a program which rewarded on grades. Those I don't think I've seen one of those succeed. Don't hold me to that, but I know the one in the New York City, for what it's worth, did not work when it compensated people for grades. The ones that compensate for attendance do. And there's a certain element of it, same thing, there's a very simple issue on the health one that should concern us all. If you reward people for growing, like, really? You're going to cut off the kid that was like actually eating well and the parents were doing everything they could and he just was not growing well? So, I mean, I'd be generally concerned about looking at the outcome measure and rewarding on that. You want to reward on the behavior as much as you can, not the outcome. So attending school, going to the hospital, going to getting preventative care, that you want to reward. So when we have seen big changes in behavior from that, they're not very cost effective unless you include redistribution as one of the goals, and then it's okay. But if your goal is to, for instance, get children into school, the problem is, and I mean this in a twisted kind of way, that you're going to end up paying a lot of kids that are going to school anyhow, right? And that's a problem when you're thinking about cost effectiveness of, for every $1 million I spend, how much more school am I generating? It's not a problem if you say that's okay as long as they were really poor. It's just part of a redistribution type incentive, and then it's fine. Then we add in a second objective.
So it needs to be targeted.
But the ones that do target, when they do that, they still end up compensating a lot of people that are going to school anyhow. Yeah. Right? And that you just have to recognize that if you're okay with that, then that's fine.
Dean, if you don't
I am.
mind my interjecting, these kinds of, I find this incredibly useful to know that, that rewarding people for grades does not work, but rewarding people for attendance does work. That's the kind of specific information that we really need to have. Is there a way for us to access the results of the IPA studies?
Yeah, although I just want to be clear, I'm reporting on one study there. I don't want to make categorical statements that can never work.
But there's lots of studies out there, and in terms of what works and doesn't work, and Mayor Bloomberg in New York adopted it because he saw it in Latin America. And there are places in Latin America where it's working, places where it's not working. So the data exists.
So talking about connectivity, we absolutely have to have a vehicle through which we can learn about what is working and what is not working, so we don't waste our time.
I think, can I just make one point on this though, please? I think it's really important to separate it's very important to separate what we're trying to achieve from how we're trying to achieve it. So if we focus singularly on interventions, we're ignoring the fact of innovation and creativity in the world. And we know that those didn't work. We don't know that they couldn't work. And we don't know that there isn't some other limiting factor that was preventing it from working. We just don't know. And so I think this point on local conversations around goals really matters. And one of the things the Millennium Development Goals has done is help take away the competition between communities to think, oh, is it health or education or infrastructure or agriculture? Because they were all fighting for scraps, so many of those communities originally. But what it has said is, wait a second, you're trying to do this and I'm trying to do this, and that could go together. And I think when we're talking about poverty, I like the analogy of a human body, like which is most important? Well, which organ is most important in my body? I don't know. I like my lungs, I like my heart, I like my liver. I think I like my brain sometimes I don't. But there's a lot of things that can go wrong with each of those organs, and there's a lot of things that can go wrong with how they connect, and the ways in which we spot those things, we fix those things as they go along. It's kind of like a society getting out of poverty, and there are a lot of things that I think have to have space for innovation around over the long term. But that common agenda of how we define success at the community level, at the local level, if we take an expansive but crisp and measured approach to that at the outset, I think that can really set an extraordinary platform for many more of these breakthroughs to happen in many different ways around the world.
So connectivity. I'm sorry, speaking of connectivity, we need to connect more with the audience.
Klaus Lengefeld from GIZ Germany, German International Cooperation Agency. We are in the business of poverty alleviation since 40 years ago, so I'm challenged to speak here. I work in the travel and tourism sector, and my question is on connectivity. Because we have seen, on the one hand, we have done business incubation, and it makes sense, but it makes more sense if we connect the economy of the poor with the big economy. But one very clear thing is, if we look into hotels, job-wise, it's the best business in the world. We have 20 jobs per 1 million euro of sales volume of the big corporations like Hilton, and all the other industries have only 2 to 6 jobs. In Asia, even more, because Asia, the ratio of jobs per room is higher than anywhere in the world. But the second thing we're looking into is supply chains. We have already examples here at the meeting, like Marriott. They have done the Supply Diversity Initiative. I'm not sure if Simon Cooper is here. They said we want 15% of our supplies coming from businesses in the hands of disadvantaged people. It's like Latinos, it's like handicapped people, it's like women. And they already achieved 2 or 3 years ago 14%. It's more than in North America, and it was $470 million US. They redirected from their supply chains to those businesses in the hands of disadvantaged people. So this is you have to connect the corporates and the big economy to inject money into the pro-poor economy. I discussed with Brian yesterday, my dream project is not happening. If you go look into the hotel where the shampoo comes from and the soap comes from, usually in the more luxury, it comes from Molton Brown in England or from Australia, not from the local economy. If those hotels would decide we want all of our amenities come from local production, we would have big chances for women cooperatives doing shampoos, because technologically wise, that's not a problem. And this is, my question is, how can we make not just the big corporations spend for education and training of poor people, but also connect them to their economies? This is my question.
I would like to just comment that very quickly. I think we're doing the same thing, and definitely this is the way. I mean, we just started, we're going through a partnership with the big retailers, and one of the aspects that we're looking at is not just developing the stores in Indonesia, but also how to bring Indonesian products outside for export. In other words, that it can be distributed to all their stores worldwide, not just in Indonesia. And I think this is the key. A lot of the issue comes with, obviously, standardization of product, quality of products, and this is where the training comes in. So what they do now is provide training and to basically SME in order to have their quality of product be in line, so that it can then be supplied to their stores. I think things like this needs to happen, and we need to multiply it much more. Right now, the Indonesian government is...
How can we multiply this more?
By that, But the corporations have to decide. Yes, of course, the corporation have to decide. But when we look at partnership, this is the kind of things that we have to put in terms of conditions, right? And what do we want out of a partnership? And I think if all private sector similarly thinking that way, of course it will be faster. But one aspect is from the government side. For example, right now our government is putting that all retail store 20% has to be for SME, right? They have to put certain area 20% for SME products. Now, this is good. I'm not saying it's good, but it goes beyond handing out. And I would like to stress the importance of the mentality of people when you just be given handouts. There has to be coming from their direction as well in what they can do in order for improvement. So I think although the government can play a role as well by putting on regulations, I have to say that we have to be careful in building up the mentality of these SMEs. I mean, providing opportunity is one thing, but there is definitely no free handouts.
But many major multinational corporations have found that local supply chain development is much more cost effective because they're trying to develop those markets anyway. And I'm sure Nadya is on this now. She's going to start supplying, the Shangri-La.
Hope so.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Hernandez with Hewlett-Packard, and perhaps it's kind of appropriate to have a private sector representative. I wanted to comment, social innovation has been part of HP's DNA from the very beginning, and we have social innovation programs in health, in education, in entrepreneurship, and in sustainability, so we cut across that. But what we prioritize, going back to your original question, I think what our core competency is, it's technology. So what we do is we leverage our knowledge of technology, such as perhaps mobile applications that you mentioned, to address the challenges that we have in all of those areas. And that would be our contribution to making this a better place. And my challenge, I guess, or my question to the panel is that all of us have to kind of have a different role in this equation, because it's a very complex problem. And the private sector, as you mentioned, has been doing a lot of great things and should be, I think, allowed to do this more and to scale up. And we are already talking about partnerships to scale up some of our programs, even at this forum, right? Where I see the government and perhaps aid agencies coming in is more, someone mentioned the bottom of the pyramid. But Shinta also mentioned there's a very basic entrepreneur or startup, and then there's that next level. If you take that kind of on the country level, where I feel there's a little bit of a donut hole or a gap in that pyramid, where a lot of aid, a lot of support from the government is going to the bottom of the pyramid, but there's actually a layer above that that gets left behind, because they actually have jobs. It might be a midwife, and there are thousands of them in Indonesia or the Philippines. But if you empower that, if you help them with some support, it'll actually leapfrog into a whole different level of, whether that little midwife can have a much bigger clinic and actually, serve a bigger community. And we've seen that happen in places like Indonesia or the Philippines. So that's what I'm curious about, that there's that donut hole, I think, inside that pyramid that gets left out as everyone's focusing on the bottom. And it might be that the private sector or some other stakeholders can work on that. The ones that need help, need support, but actually can help themselves, whereas the aid agencies focus on the one that really cannot help themselves. And perhaps by dividing a little bit that, the different levels of poverty, that will accomplish much more and can be more ambitious perhaps than what you said, Karlan.
Can I respond to that? Well, I totally agree with you. Based on my experience, a couple of months ago, there was a foundation that contacted me, and then, well, they heard about the story, how I work with farmers, and they really want to help these, ending the persistence of poverty by investing in children's education. And then there's one man said that, how can I help these children? Is it possible if I can give you like a fund for their children's education? And I was like, okay, that was great. But I would like to tweak it a little bit. Instead of you giving like fresh money to them, how about if you, give the farmers, give their parents a chance to build new roses, so they can have, they can expand their business, and then they can get more profit, and from there, they can save for their children's education. So that's the missing link. If you want to help the poor, you don't really, sometimes I don't say NGO is bad. NGO is really helpful, but there's a missing link, how to assist the fund that you want to give to the poor. If you economics gentlemen may know about these assets and liabilities. I just know about that term. But these poor had no idea about that. If you give them $1, they will spend it for cigarette. You give them $100, a ton of cigarettes. And they have no idea how to use the fund as an asset. They will use it, for a daily activities, and it will only have one life. But if they put it in a business format, it will raise more money, and it will make it sustainable. So I totally agree with you, and well, that's, I think, how to respond to that.
Well, and one of the things we haven't talked about in response to that question is long-term objectives versus short-term objectives. And if you go back to the question about hospitality employees, that job creation to me is more of a short-term, it could be a short-term opportunity. How do you take unemployed folks, train them to work in the hospitality industry? Education is a longer-term strategy in terms of young people and getting them ready. The hole in the pyramid goes back to role definition. So you've got aid organizations that, as you say, are focused on the bottom of the pyramid. You've got the private sector that are trying to create jobs, and folks, by their own volition, opportunity, some help are going to get there. What you miss is that, NGOs actually have a role to play in the middle. That, we distribute $5 billion a year across the world. It's not like a UN budget, but Klaus and I were talking last night, and he said, well, would you fund, that job creation training? The answer is yes. But until you're in the same room at the same time defining the whole, then you don't know who should fund it. NGOs are good when we are actually focused, pretty ineffective when we're all over the place, which, happens too often.
Thank you. 20 years ago, 93% of the poor of the world were in low-income countries. But nowadays, we find that 72% of all the poor in the world, of the 900, almost 1 billion poor, are in middle-income countries. So this changes the nature of how to understand poverty. And in that sense, poverty is not anymore an issue, mainly an issue of foreign aid, of international support. It's a matter of internal inequalities. It's a matter of income redistribution, and it's a matter of focusing development on certain areas. So, and we talk about the role of the private sector, and I think the private sector and the initiative and the small the social enterprise play an important role. But if you talk about who is the primus inter pares, the head of that, has to be government, and government policies to reduce inequality, to widen markets, to create all the opportunities that would allow to small businesses and all the initiatives to create. And I want to highlight in Asia, for example, the role of social transfers. Somebody mentioned the conditional cash transfers over there. And those are not handouts. Those are not people who are begging and receiving money. And I also disagree that what the poor, when they receive money, they will misspend it or spend it in something irrelevant. I think the evidence is when we have social transfers that are regular, that are predictable, the poor invested very wisely. In South Africa, households that have receive cash transfers, poverty reduction cash transfers, have something like 60% more enrollment of girls in school. The average size of children in households in Brazil receiving Bolsa de Familia, which is a social transfer, is 8 centimeters taller than those households in similar conditions that do not receive that. So I say the role of reducing inequalities is crucial in fostering, creating the environment for wider development. My question is, do you agree or do you not agree with this?
And we really do need to wind up, so here's an opportunity to answer the question, to give last-minute conclusions.
I'll give a very quick take. I think this is a huge point. My colleague Andy Summer pointed out, the shift towards middle-income countries. I think it goes back to the previous question. Each country has a very different set of dynamics, so blanket assertions are tricky. One point of this is that it's probably actually, in a historical sense, temporary, because it's a great news story that these countries are graduating from the need for aid. It does mean that those countries are going to need to tackle their own problems more so. Many of those countries are blended, taking aid and then giving aid even to other countries technologically and financially. But you're also seeing a redefinition of what poverty means, because it's not just going to be extreme poverty. It's increasingly going to be $2 a day poverty, which in an inequality sense is just as profound. And we're seeing that even in the United States now, the debate on inequality has taken off in a way that would have been very much unpredicted. So the notion of social stability and egalitarian, at least opportunity, I think is a global phenomenon we're seeing everywhere. I think we're also seeing that there's a need to do a backward induction, if you will. Some places really still need to focus on the rural poor. In many places, the poorest of the poor still aren't getting reached. If you look in much of rural Africa, they're still relatively untouched. In some of the more remote parts of this region, they're still relatively untouched. But in others, it's actually just a shifted game. And so as we solve each problem, or as local communities solve each problem, that doesn't mean their problem's done. It just means the next one goes on or comes up. And probably the deepest problem we're going to face is the fragile states, where in a decade or so, most of the extreme poverty will be in what are called the fragile states, where they don't even have the stability of systems in place yet to think through what is the balance of public and private. And that's a really tough kind of remaining problem for the world to think through.
We must, unfortunately, end now. But I think that this panel has illustrated for us the significance of the forum's mission and orientation this time, the significance of connectivity. So indeed, we must, at a local level, come together and identify what our priorities are, but then we must also reach out to the academic community, to the researchers community, to understand what they have found to be most effective in addressing those particular problems. And we must be connecting with the corporate community and with the NGO community to create the ecosystems in which our solutions would thrive. I hope you all will join me in saying thank you to this panel.